I see a lot of folks here that I know, a few I don't know. I haven't been to Detroit in quite a while, so I'm happy to be back with this particular program that we're hosting here today. So let me be the first to say good morning and welcome. My name is Alicia Williams, and I'm Vice President and Director of Community Development and Policy Studies at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Detroit branch of the Federal Reserve for Tools Toward Market Restoration, where growth and opportunity converge. The acronym you'll hear us using to refer to this conference is TTMR. So before I proceed, I want to thank our partner in this event, the American Bankers Association. They were one of our first partners along with IFF in the first iteration of TTMR theme, and that was a few years ago. It explored the role of community capital in fostering redevelopment. Krista Shrunk, the ABA's Director of Regulatory Compliance Policy, was involved with our planning for this conference from the very beginning, and we're very grateful for her support. I actually didn't have a chance to meet you before the program. Hi. So you'll be hearing from her in a few minutes. I also want to acknowledge that my boss is here. He's Executive Vice President and Director of Research, Dan Sullivan. So he's back there, in the corner over there. And, just to show you how important this is, he could have been in Washington at FOMC, but he's here with us. So that's really, a great feat. Also, of course, I want to thank our speakers and panelists, many who have traveled for some distance to be here. Your enthusiasm for participating in this conversation has served to reinforce how important it is. My responsibilities at the Fed include oversight of the Community Development and Policy Studies Department. Each Reserve Bank, and there are 12 nationwide, has a community development function. These departments were formed after the Community Reinvestment Act. The Community Reinvestment Act, also known as CRA, was passed in 1977 to ensure banks lend and invest in communities from where they draw deposits and to begin to reverse the effects of redlining. Redlining, along with explicit racial covenants in government finance programs, was at one time federal policy. While the policies and laws changed long ago, actual change is taking longer. While not a perfect tool, CRA has done much to drive capital into underserved communities, even as the financial services industry has changed in the past 40 years. And I'm sure many of you know that the banking regulatory agencies are currently working on modernizing CRA. Lots of work remains to be done on many levels. Wealth and income disparity issues continue to be raised in communities across the nation. We also know from some of the very best research that where you live has more impact on your future than just about anything else. Over the course of the past year or so, the theme of economic inclusion has come to the forefront of much of our work. In Chicago, research conducted by Maud Toussaint-Comeau and Robert Newberger has focused on understanding the dynamics of job creation in minority neighborhoods in comparison to regional trends. Even as regionals grow economically, they have shown inner city and some suburban areas remain isolated from the broader prosperity. Our peer city tool identification tool, also known as PSET, and you have the little postcards on your table there that describes it. It's an online data visualization tool that enables municipalities to identify their peers across metrics, capturing housing affordability, economic resilience, demographic outlook, and equity. We have used this tool over the past several months as the basis of conversation about economic inclusion in legacy cities, including Flint and Detroit. Our partner in this effort was Alicia Kasusi, who heads up the Older Industrial Cities program at the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, or TFN. TFN was also a partner in the study tour that explored strategies for resurgence in legacy cities. The white paper that resulted highlighted the need to connect economic growth, that is, job creation, to economic opportunity for all residences. The paper can also be found on our website at chicagofed.org and is under the Community Development tab. And of course, a major component of economic inclusion is access to financial products and services. Like it or not, our community runs on credit. Fair access to and responsible use of credit are core building blocks of economic mobility and obviously core themes of our work. If you're interested in learning more about any of the publications or tools that I just mentioned, you can visit, again, our community development page at chicagofed.org, or you can also look at the conference app. How many people have downloaded the conference app? Oh, come on, got to be technical, come on. So we've got on your tables instructions to download the app because some of the presentations are there, so you may want to do that. And then also people that signed up to attend, they're listed on the app because, as you could probably tell, we're trying to go paperless. I know we're not alone in seeking greater understanding of the many facets and implications of economic inclusion. We hope today's conference adds nuances to these conversations in two ways. One, by focusing on policy, we better understand, examine, and potentially address the systems and structures in place that inhibit economic inclusion, and thereby open discussions about ways to address these impediments. Second, the dynamics of exclusion are widespread, but our geographic focus today and tomorrow is urban places, specifically Midwestern cities. The 7th Federal Reserve District includes the majority of Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and all of Iowa, and the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. So even though we're in Detroit, TTMR is not only about Detroit. In fact, we developed this conference in an effort to understand the trends and dynamics affecting places, communities, or entire communities that were long facing market failure, as often demonstrated by housing, labor, or capital markets. Generally, elements of all of those can be felt in Detroit. However, conversations stemming from TTMR are intended to challenge community and economic development leaders in the broadest sense to envision pathways to markets that operate without subsidies. We know from experience that markets fail, often with help from social and political forces, and people and places are simply left out. This is a conference about unpacking and better understanding the circumstances that lead to market failures and innovations to bring capital and information resources to bear in effective ways to induce positive change. Our agenda will take us from a historical context, looking back at policies that divided us and have had an enduring effect, to the present day, and we're all in really interesting times, as the proverb goes, and leaves us with some ideas for the future. Richard Rothstein, who you'll be hearing from first today, is a leading expert on policy and in particular the housing finance system's evolution of racial segregation. You all received copies of his book when you checked in, The Color of Law. We're very lucky to have him here today because not only is he in high demand, but because his work lays the foundation for our conversation over the next 2 days. Following Richard, Dan Hartley, an economist with the Chicago Fed, will present a paper he co-authored with colleagues Dan Aronson and Bosch Mazumdar using recently digitized maps. Their findings illustrated the persistent effects of redlining, which hinder social and economic mobilities for communities and people. We will then move into a series of panels where our speakers will share perspectives derived from their work and research. That will be our MO for the remainder of the conference, with panels addressing various topics. Our housing panel will explore potential new tools to promote home ownership in low-value markets. Our panelists represent diverse perspectives, but share the view that both wealth accumulation and neighborhood stability are enhanced through sustainable home ownership. The employment panel will explore profiles of the unemployed and strategies for various market conditions. Our panelists bring both a national overview of policy and tactics combined with a local, real-time perspective from Racine, Wisconsin. And then after that panel, we'll adjourn for the day. So tomorrow, I hope you'll arrive early to network. And you can start that at 7:30 a.m. over coffee, but our formal program starts at 8:30 with a media panel. Local and national journalists will discuss the role that media plays in shaping an urban narrative through words and images, and also the vital role that news organizations have to play in advancing urban agendas. We will then turn to place-based investing strategies and their role in reversing disinvestment. Following research on the neighborhood impact of various capital flows, panelists will describe innovations in impact investing. The final panel of the conference will pull everything together, building on a paper entitled The Cost of Segregation, produced by the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago and the Urban Institute. We hope to close the conference looking forward. Our panelists are community leaders looking to implement and advance economic inclusion in their respective communities in the context of very different market conditions from one another. As I mentioned at the beginning of this remarks, our partner in this effort is the American Bankers Association, and that's not by accident. Bankers are in many ways place-based investors, dependent on functioning markets for success. As I described earlier, the Community Reinvestment Act, which motivates the community development activities across the Federal Reserve System, celebrated its 40th anniversary last year. However, it remains a work in progress, and our hope is that the discussions here today and tomorrow will inform that work to some degree. So in closing, if you haven't done so, and I know a lot of you have not, please download the app. And again, the instructions are on the table. And if you need some help, let us know. I'll be happy to help you too. I've already done it twice today. So you can see me. It's a great way to connect with others here and learn more about the speakers. And it's also a great resource as well. As I also mentioned, the Fed's community development research is attached to my profile in the app. Our speakers and panelists have also added papers, presentations, articles, interviews, and other resources. So please check those out. We'll also be tweeting throughout the conference. The hashtag is TTMR2018. So join the conversation. So again, I want to thank our partner, the American Banker Association for joining us. But I also want to take a moment to thank all of the staff here in Detroit who really has made this possible for us to be here today. So we should give them a round of applause. So with that, I wish you an engaging experience. I think it's going to really be an interesting discussion. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Krista Schrank, our colleague from the American Bankers Association. Thank you.
Thanks, Alicia. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the American Bankers Association, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's TTMR conference. I'm joined here today by my colleague, Joe Pigg, who's sitting at the front table, and I can tell you that we're just delighted that you've taken time and have made it a priority to participate in this conversation on financial inclusion and community and economic development. As Alicia mentioned, banks play an important role in helping to create jobs and promote economic growth and prosperity. And for this reason, ABA is pleased to partner with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago to sponsor this conference. We look forward to learning more about the circumstances that lead to market failures that in turn cause people and communities to be left behind. We're also excited to hear about the innovative strategies that practitioners have put in place to meet market needs and to really change the futures of communities and families. This year's conference comes at a pivotal time. As everyone knows, last year was the 40th anniversary of the Community Reinvestment Act, and bankers and regulators and community groups acknowledge that it's time to refresh the regulations that implement CRA, particularly as it relates to how the development of technology has impacted how consumers prefer to access financial products and services. We're also having a national conversation about income inequality and financial inclusion. And while this conference focuses on cities in the Midwest, again, as Alicia mentioned, these are issues that impact towns and cities across the nation. There are many communities that are struggling with economic viability, and I include in that my hometown, which is located in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. Even in prosperous areas, housing affordability remains a challenge for many individuals and families near job centers. And the dialogue continues regarding viable credit products that are safe and affordable, that bring financial services products to underserved populations and bring them into the financial mainstream. So with all of these factors in mind, I personally am looking forward to learning a lot over the course of the next couple of days and hearing about the research and the important work of the conference panelists. After all, as Alicia mentioned, there's still a lot of work to do for CRA. Again, ABA appreciates the opportunity to work with the Chicago Fed on this conference, and we extend a special thank you to Susan Longworth. She's just been fantastic in the work that she's done to plan the conference and to help communicate with ABA as we've been working to promote this meeting to our members. At this time, I'll turn the podium over to Susan, who has some logistical announcements for you before we begin today.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. Thank you for your patience, as we got a little bit of a late start, but we will be able to catch up. Thank you to all of our speakers and panelists for being here, especially those of you that come from out of town. I know there's great demands on your time, and even though our weather has turned sunny, I understand there are some mechanical issues this morning with some flights that have caused some challenges. So, and also thank you to all of our Detroit staff. And we couldn't obviously do this without you. Again, my name is Susan Longworth. I'm going to be your MC for the duration of the conference. So you'll see me pop up from time to time and sort of make sure that I'm herding the cats in the right direction and we stay on time as much as possible. And so my job for the next 2 minutes, and before I turn it over to Sheila to introduce Rich Rothstein, is to impart some very important information to make sure that everything is going to go smoothly. And so I'm going to reiterate what's already been said, and that is to download the app. The instructions are on the table. You'll notice that it is about the only thing on your table because we are going as paperless as possible. That's the new phrase I've coined for this conference. So the PowerPoints and papers that are being presented are all attached to the speaker's profile in the app. You also find other resources that some of the other panelists have provide, and that's all to sort of extend and deepen the conversation beyond the brief time that people sit on a panel. The wireless instructions are also on your table. And we are live tweeting at TTMR 2018, hashtag TTMR 2018, so please join in that conversation. And if you have any technical issues at all, chances are your neighbor has figured them out, so that's a great way to meet people. We also have some technical folks that are flying below the radar around here, but I bet you can find them out who can help you if you've not been able to access those resources. So moving from the technical to the practical, keep your badges. These badges will help you get in and out of the building if you need to leave today, need to come back tomorrow. Those are the things that are going to be able to hopefully smooth things a little bit getting in and out of this building. I know it's not the easiest thing. There are copies of the agendas on the table. There is one per table, so I'm going to ask you to share. You can also obviously find them on your app. If there's any questions about sort of what's happening, again, feel free to have that conversation. Most important thing, if you haven't heard anything I've said so far, is that bathrooms are out past the elevators to your left and then left again, and you'll find those facilities there. Following Rich's presentation, we're going to be taking a brief break to get lunch. The buffet is being set up out there. There's more desserts out there. There are some desserts over there. So hopefully in all of that, you will be able to procure a level of sugar that's going to keep you going for the rest of the afternoon. But so I will come back up and sort of guide you when it's time to go and come back, and then we'll launch into our panels for the rest of the day. And so I think that's it. I know I mentioned the app. Please download it. And so with that, I have the honor of turning the podium over to Sheila Clay, who is President and CEO of the Neighborhood Service Organization here in Detroit, and also a former member of the Detroit Branch Board of Directors. And so she has a very busy day today, and we're very honored to have her join us this morning.
Good morning. I see some familiar faces, especially those from the Detroit and Chicago Bank of the Federal Reserve. I'm really glad to see them. It's always an honor to walk into this building. As Susan said, my name is Sheila Clay, and I'm the President and CEO of Neighborhood Service Organization, which is a nonprofit human service agency that covers Wayne and Oakland County. I served as a member of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago's Detroit Board of Directors from 2009 to 2015, which were 6 of the most exciting years for me to be on this board, because it was right during the economic crisis. I had the opportunity to serve with Chairman Bernanke and Chairman Yellen, and so it was quite an honor for me. And today it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Rich Rothstein. However, since I have the floor, I want to take a couple of minutes to tell you why this conversation is important to me. You can read my bio in the app that I finally got downloaded myself, but I need to tell you about the organization I've led for the past 18 years. At NSO, I'm always proud to say that we meet people on the street. You could say we are on the front lines addressing issues of homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, chronic poverty, affordable housing, and unemployment. We are supporting the people affected by these issues long before they were social determinants of health or barriers to economic inclusion. This is not to criticize, but rather to stress that these issues have existed for a long time. I'm proud of what we've accomplished, but as I step down later this year, I'm leaving knowing there's still much work to be done. As Alicia mentioned earlier, income disparities continue to widen, and as everyone in the room knows, whether you are from Detroit or not, the systems, services, and resources in place to address these issues are stretched, even as demand seems to increase every single day. So at some point, you have to step back and ask why. I believe that a firm understanding of how we arrived at a place can help to guide the way forward, which is why opening today's conference with remarks from Rich Rothstein is so appropriate. Rich is first and foremost a historian. His book, which everyone received, provides us with an historical understanding of segregation in this country. You can read his bio also on the app, where there are also links to some very recent interviews that he had, including ones with Tahisha Coates. I encourage you to check those out. But I'm going to leave you with a quote directly from the book's website, which I think sums up the important contribution that he's going to make here today. Quote, "In this groundbreaking history of the modern American metropolis, Rich Rothstein, a leading authority on housing policy, explodes the myth that America's cities came to be racially divided through de facto segregation. That is, through individual prejudices, income differerences, or the actions of private institutions like banks and real estate agencies. Rather, the color of law incontrovertibly makes clear that it was de jure segregation, the laws and policies decisions passed by local, state, and federal governments that actually promoted the discriminatory patterns that continue to this day." With that, I invite you to join me in welcoming Rich Rothstein.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me here today. I feel especially fortunate to be here today because I foolishly went to the Federal Reserve building, not the Federal Reserve Bank. Who knew? How many cities have a Federal Reserve building as well as a Federal Reserve Bank 5 miles apart? It's quite a feat. Anyhow, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for engaging with me in this conversation. As you all know, in the 20th century, this country made a resolution to abolish racial segregation. We began with law schools and then higher education, and then in 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education with elementary and secondary schools. And then a civil rights movement in the 1960s succeeded in getting rid of racial segregation and everything from buses to water fountains to public accommodations to lunch counters. And yet, after all of this litigation and civil rights activity, we've left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one of them in which I've lived, and certainly this one here, had clearly defined areas that were all or mostly white, and clearly defined areas that were all or mostly African American. And we all, and I'm not making myself an exception, all of us, everyone in this room and everyone in the country, sort of accepts this as part of the natural environment. We think it's unfortunate, but we don't think it's an offense in the way that the other segregations that we abolished were an offense. We don't feel under any obligation to do anything about it. It's too bad, we say, but it all happened because of market forces or private decisions or unfortunate racial prejudice. And it can only unhappen if we marshal somehow market forces and different ways of viewing each other. We've given a name to our refusal to do anything about it, to the rationalization that we've adopted to accept residential segregation, and that name is, it's de facto segregation. Unlike all the other segregations that we abolished, this one is just segregation in fact. not segregation in law, not segregation in policy, not segregation in regulation by regulation. And because it all happened by accident, by private prejudice, by market forces, African Americans don't happen typically to have enough money to live in middle-class communities, or people like to live with each other of the same race, or private sellers or real estate agents or banks discriminated in the way in which they financed housing. Because it all happened by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. And the Supreme Court has embraced this commonplace theory. It has said that we have de facto segregation, and therefore we're prohibited from doing anything explicitly to undo it. I spent most of my career studying education policy. I've come to this field fairly recently. I got into this because I understand that we cannot solve the educational problems in this country so long as we have segregated schools. And I came to understand that the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. So I began to wonder how they came to be segregated. And in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. Some of you may be familiar with it, although it's in the field of education, not housing. It was a decision that concerned the school districts of Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. And those two districts had adopted very, very token school desegregation plans. Both of them had a choice plan in which the adolescent children could choose which high school to go to. But if the choice that they made was going to exacerbate the racial homogeneity of a school, that choice would be disfavored in favor of a choice of a child who would help to integrate a school. So if you had an all-white school or a mostly all-white school, and one place was left, and both a black and a white child applied for that place, the black child would be given some preference because that child would help to desegregate the school. It was a trivial token program. Most high school students don't want to go to school outside their own neighborhoods and away from their own friends. And the cases where you have one place left and both a black and a white child apply for it couldn't be more insignificant. And yet the Supreme Court was outraged by this policy to desegregate the schools. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the plurality opinion, and he said that this policy of desegregation violated the Constitution because the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on his part. And he went on to say that the neighborhoods in which they were located were segregated de facto because of private prejudice, because of market forces, because of people's choices of wanting to live with each other of the same race. And where you have segregation by accident, I'm putting it in my own terms now, where you have segregation by accident, it can only unhappen by accident. And any explicit attempt to racially desegregate would violate the 14th Amendment. Well, I read this case, and I remembered previously having read of a case in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the school districts that was involved in this decision, where a white homeowner in an all-white suburb, a single-family home suburb of Louisville called Shively, had an African-American friend living in the city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a middle-class income, wife and child, and wanted to move to a neighborhood of single-family homes, and no real estate agent would show him one. And so the white homeowner bought a second home in the suburb of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend as a way of helping him to move into this community. And when the African-American family moved into the home, a mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. The police couldn't identify any of the perpetrators. They then firebombed the home, and the police were unable to identify a perpetrator. Then they dynamited the home, and still impossible to identify a perpetrator. And when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. And I had read a few other things. I'm not pretending that was the only thing that got me into this, but I had read a few other things here and there. And I began to wonder if maybe these individual instances of government participation in enforcing segregation or creating segregation were not simply individual isolated instances, but were a systematic pattern of government involvement that made the notion of de facto segregation something of a myth. And in the course of the research that I've reflected in this book, I came to the conclusion that yes, indeed, there was such a systematic and powerful pattern of federal, state, and local government that was racially explicit, not the unintended consequence of neutral actions, a racially explicit policy designed to ensure that African Americans and whites in this country could not live near one another. That these policies were so powerful that they determine the racial landscape of today. That if I'm right, that, and I will say this, I can say this now, I haven't been saying it too much before, but the book has been out for a year now, and not a single fact has been challenged by any historian, so I'm convinced that it's right. If it's the case, as it is, that residential segregation is the creation of government, enforced by government, not de facto, but as the courts say, de jure, then it's as unconstitutional as the segregation of water fountains and the segregation of buses and the segregation of restaurants and of schools and of colleges and of law schools. And if it's as unconstitutional as these other segregations that we abolished in the mid-20th century, then we have an obligation as American citizens, all of us, to do something to undo it. And I hope we'll have a discussion, something about this later, but undoing it is not reinvesting in already segregated communities. I'm not opposed to that. I'm not saying that the effort to improve conditions in low-income communities is not an important effort. But desegregating and reinforcing segregation are not the same thing, and sometimes they come into conflict. So let me describe for a few minutes what some of the major policies that the federal government followed in order to ensure that we have racial segregation. And I'm only going to touch on a few of them. There were many, many others of these. I've detailed them all in the book. Many, many policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed that all reinforced each other and created a system of racial segregation that endures to this date. I'm going to begin by talking about public housing. All of us think we know I know, just as I did. Like I say, I'm not accusing you of anything that I didn't fault myself for also. Think of public housing as a place where poor people live, a place where there are single mothers with children, young men without access to jobs in the formal economy, and sometimes without hope, sometimes acting out, attracting the attention of the police, getting into confrontations with the police. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Excuse me one second. Sorry. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began as a program for working and middle-class families who could fully afford to pay the cost of their rent, of their housing and rent, but for whom there was no housing in mid-20th century housing shortages. The first civilian public housing in this country was built by the Public Works Administration in the New Deal beginning in 1933. It was for white, predominantly white working-class families who could fully afford to pay for housing, but in the Depression there was a shortage of housing and there was none available for them. The Public Works Administration also built some housing for African Americans, always on a segregated basis, frequently segregating communities that hadn't known segregation before, that had been integrated. Now that may surprise some of you, although those of you who know your urban economic history won't be so surprised. In the mid-20th century, earliest 20th century, workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. Thank you so much. Workers didn't have automobiles to get to work, and most jobs were in downtown areas, concentrated in downtown areas, factory districts and other workplaces. And so workers had to live close enough to their workplaces to walk to work. So if you had factories which were employing African Americans and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants and rural migrants, the workers all had to live in roughly, broadly the same neighborhoods in order to get there. The great African American novelist, poet, playwright Langston Hughes, I'm sure some of you have read some of his work, wrote an autobiography. And in his autobiography, called The Big C, he described how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland neighborhood near downtown. We don't think of Cleveland as having integrated neighborhoods near downtown today, but he grew up in an integrated neighborhood. He says his best friend was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl in high school. But the Public Works Administration demolished integrated housing in that community to create two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland that otherwise might never have developed with the intensity that it did. And this went on all over the country. Everywhere, housing was segregated, not respecting previous patterns of segregation, but creating segregation where it otherwise hadn't existed. I like in the book, as you'll notice if you read it, to talk about liberal places, self-satisfied places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley, California. Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area around the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Central Square neighborhood, was a neighborhood that was about half black and half white, an integrated neighborhood. The Public Works Administration demolished housing in that Central Square neighborhood and built two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites. It built other segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston area, creating a pattern of segregation that I think we can confidently say would not otherwise have developed with nearly the intensity it did in the Boston area. During World War II, the practice continued as hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production to take jobs in the war industries here in the Detroit area as well as around the country. And the population explosion as a result of the migration of defense workers, both white and black, was so great that if the government wanted the ships and the airplanes and the tanks and the jeeps to keep coming off the assembly lines, it had to find housing for these workers. In my book, I focus particularly, as I say, I like to focus on these self-satisfied places. If it happened there, I think you can be persuaded that it happened everywhere. I focus on a suburb of Berkeley, California, called Richmond, a deep water port where the Kaiser shipyards established a business at the beginning of the war. Eventually 5 shipyards were built, employing 100,000 workers. Some of them had families, probably an influx of population of 300,000 or so, to a community, Richmond, that was all white, and of 20,000. I don't know how you grow a community from 20,000 to 300,000 in just 4 years. But that's what the federal government had to do if it wanted the ships to continue to be produced. So it built housing for the workers. It built temporary housing, pretty shoddily constructed, along the railroad tracks and in the industrial areas for the African Americans who had come to the shipyards to work, and more stable housing for the whites in the residential areas of Richmond east of the industrial area. And this is not, like I say, I want to make clear, this is not because African Americans happened to say they wanted to live in temporary, shoddy housing and whites happened to want to live in stable, more permanent housing. These were explicitly designated projects. And again, it went on all over the country. Here in the Detroit area as well, housing for war workers was always built on a segregated basis. In Richmond, the justification for building only temporary housing for the African Americans and stable housing for the whites was that the city of Richmond announced that at the end of the war, any African Americans who had migrated to the city to take jobs in the war industry would have to leave, whereas the whites could remain, so there's no reason to build stable housing for the African American workers. After World War II, there was still an enormous housing shortage. Not only had no housing been built during the Depression except for these Public Works Administration projects, excuse me, and during the war, it had been prohibited to use construction materials for civilian purposes except for housing for war workers. And so the housing shortage was exacerbated. And after the war, millions of returning war veterans came home and needed housing, forming families, living in Quonset huts and open fields, and doubled up with relatives. We had actually a national mother-in-law crisis at that time as a result. And President Truman had to address it. And so he proposed a vast expansion of the National Public Housing Program. Again, we're not talking about housing for poor people. These were working class families who needed housing, returning war veterans. They all had jobs in the post-war boom, but there was no housing available for them, and so the government proposed, Truman proposed, expansion of the public housing program. And conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's proposal for expanded public housing. They wanted to defeat it not for racial reasons. It was always segregated. Nobody questioned that the housing would be segregated. Not because they didn't like poor people. This was for working class families, people who had jobs, returning war veterans, but simply because they thought that the government should not be involved in the housing market. This was a socialistic. The private sector should take care of it. Not that the private sector was taking care of this enormous housing crisis. But they came up with a device, a legislative device that we know as a poison pill strategy to defeat the 1949 Housing Act. And the strategy was simply that they would propose an amendment. This was led by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. They would propose an amendment to the National Housing Act that said, well, from now on, all public housing has to be integrated. No more discrimination in public housing. No more racial discrimination. No more segregation in public housing. It was, of course, a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all. But they figured that they would vote for this amendment. They would be joined by Northern liberals who would also support the amendment. That would create a majority. The amendment would pass. The full housing bill would then come up before Congress with this integration amendment attached. And conservatives would then flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who would oppose integrated housing, though supported segregated housing, and the bill would go down to defeat. So Northern liberals mobilized to defeat the integration amendment. And I think if there's nothing else you remember about this history, it's this story that you should remember. Northern liberals mobilized against the integration amendment. They were led by the leading civil rights advocate in the United States Senate, Humphrey, whom some of you may remember. Paul Douglas, the senator from Illinois, was the other advocate. They campaigned against the integration amendment. They persuaded Northern liberals to vote against the integration amendment. Along with Southern Democrats, the integration amendment was defeated. And the full housing bill then came up to the floor as an ongoing, continued, segregated program. The program passed, and the federal government the executive branch used that vote in Congress against the integration amendment as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing, for the next 15 years. Now, very soon after this vote took place and the National Housing Act was passed, some of the major public housing programs that we know of across the country were built. And you're familiar with many of them. Certainly in Chicago, those who are from Chicago, Cabrini Green or Robert Taylor Homes, or perhaps the most famous nationwide was the Pruitt-Igoe projects in St. Louis. Pruitt-Igoe was two projects. Pruitt was for African Americans. Igoe was for whites. Not de facto, not because whites happen to like the name Igoe and blacks happen to like the name Pruitt. This was explicitly designated by federal policy to segregate these projects. Very soon afterwards, after these projects were built and filled with, remember, working class families, a development occurred everywhere in the country which was quite consistent, surprising, unexpected, and that is that large numbers of vacancies developed in the white projects, and large numbers of vacancies in the, and large long waiting lists in the black projects. Did I say that? Vacancies in the white projects, waiting lists in the black projects. Happened everywhere. Eventually, it became so conspicuous that the government and local housing agencies had to open up all of the projects to African Americans. You couldn't have a situation in a city where some projects were virtually empty and others had long waiting lists. They were all opened up to African Americans. Pretty soon thereafter, in about the same period, as you all know, industry left the cities. We no longer needed to locate factories at deep water ports or near railroad terminals because there were highways built that could bring parts to factories and ship out final products. And so industry moved out of cities like Detroit, like Chicago, into rural areas, into suburban areas. There were fewer and fewer jobs available for the residents, now increasingly African American, in public housing, and they became poorer and poorer. Eventually, the public housing had to be subsidized because families living there couldn't pay the full cost in rent. Once the subsidies began, government ceased investing in the projects. Deterioration took place, no maintenance or little maintenance, and we came to know the public housing slums that we characterize as public housing today. It's important to remember this history, but more important is to wonder, how did it happen? That all of these white projects developed large numbers of vacancies, and all the black projects had long waiting lists. The reason for that was another federal program which was even more powerful in segregating this country than the public housing program, and that was a program run by another New Deal agency, the Federal Housing Administration. Now, many of you I know are familiar with the history of how Federal Housing Administration mortgage insurance was redlined, or if that's what the Community Reinvestment Act is attempting to reverse, a refusal to lend money in African American neighborhoods. But that's not the most important policy that the Federal Housing Administration implemented. Far more powerful and important and less well known is a Federal Housing Administration program to suburbanize the entire white population, to get the white population out of cities into single-family homes in the suburbs. And we're familiar with many of the suburbs that were created by the Federal Housing Administration in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s. Most famous is probably Levittown, east of New York City. You're all familiar with that. Some of you may have heard a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about an equally large subdivision south of San Francisco. The symbol of suburbanization to the country in the 1950s came to be Los Angeles. Giant suburbs like Lakewood or Westchester or Panorama City. These were all Federal Housing Administration projects for whites only that were created in the mid-20th century with a federal prohibition on African Americans moving to them. Someone like Levitt, to take this most famous example of Levittown, could never have assembled the capital on his own to build 17,000 homes in one place. Where do you get the capital to build I don't know, any banker, if I may say so in this audience, would be out of his mind to lend someone like Levitt the money to buy the land and construct 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers. The only way that Levitt could have done this, or Henry Dolger, who built the boxes on a hillside, or any of the other developers everywhere in the country, there were thousands of these, the only way they could do it is Levitt went to the Federal Housing Administration, submitted his plans for the development, his architectural plans, the materials he was going to use, the setback from the streets, the street design, and a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt and these other builders, and they're still there today, to include in the deed of every home a clause that prohibited resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And with these commitments, the builders could then go to a bank and get a federally guaranteed loan, insured loan, to go ahead and build the subdivision. And that's how the country came to be suburbanized. The effects of this policy, as I said before, determine the racial inequality as well as the residential segregation that we have today. The homes in those suburbs in the mid-20th century sold for, these FHA-financed homes for white families only, sold for $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a piece. In today's inflation-adjusted dollars, you figure it's about $100,000. These were modest homes, 750 square feet typically for working-class families. Any working-class family, white or black, returning war veteran, could afford a home for $100,000. That's only twice national median income. The subsidy was so enormous that white families could move out of public housing, like IGO, and into these single-family homes in places like Levittown or Daly City or Westchester or Lakewood, and pay less than their monthly housing costs than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy to white families was. African Americans who were prohibited from participating in this program continued to rent homes in either public housing or in the private market in urban areas, by and large. Over the next couple of generations, you know what happened. Those homes gained in value. They appreciated. Today, homes in Levittown or Daly City or any of the other suburbs I mentioned sell, depending on the region of the country, for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. not twice national median anymore, but 6, 7 times national median income. No working class family, white or black, can afford to buy those homes today. The white families who bought those homes over the next couple of generations gained in equity, in appreciation, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000. They used that to send their children to college. They used it to weather emergencies, whether it was temporary unemployment or medical emergencies, or to subsidize their retirements, or to bequeath wealth to their children, who could then use it for down payments on homes, or their grandchildren, for that matter. African Americans, who, as I say, were prohibited from accumulating that wealth, could not do the same. Today, nationwide, African American incomes, on average, are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's a whole story about that difference as well, which I don't have time to go into now, but 60%. African American wealth is 10% of white wealth, on average. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that has never been remedied. We passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It said, okay, African Americans, you're now free to move into Levittown or Daly City or in any of these other suburbs, but they're now unaffordable, as I said, to working class families of any race. So a remedy beyond simply a prohibition on future discrimination is necessary if we really take seriously our obligation to enforce the Constitution, to remedy the segregation that was imposed by all levels of government on both African Americans and whites in order to ensure segregation. Of course, nobody would deny, I certainly wouldn't, there is enormous private prejudice in this country. Racial discrimination on a private level is rampant. Many whites would prefer or would resist, as the crowd in Louisville, Kentucky that I talked about at the beginning did, the movement of African Americans into their communities. But without federal policy to structure that discrimination, we would not have the segregation that we have today. We did not think that because whites supported racial segregation in schools or lunch counters or water fountains, that meant that it was a private result. We understood that it was de jure segregation to segregate those institutions, despite the fact that the segregation was supported by private prejudice. And by the same token, the segregation of neighborhoods is de jure segregation, despite the fact that it's supported by private prejudice. The patterns, the tragic thing about this story is it would have been so easy to avoid it and to have done things differently. Certainly, when the Public Works Administration built housing in Langston Hughes's neighborhood or in Cambridge or anywhere other places in this country where it did so, there were whites who would not have preferred or would have resisted moving into an integrated building. Of course, they were living in integrated neighborhoods before then, but they might not have wanted to live in the same building with African Americans. But the housing shortage was so enormous that for every one who refused, there were 10 waiting to take its place. And we could have established an integrated pattern. The same is true with places like Levittown or these other suburbs. There may have been some families that did not want to live in an integrated neighborhood, but the housing shortage was so enormous that for everyone who didn't, there would have been 10 willing to take its place, and we could have built integrated communities across this country that have created a very, very different pattern from the one we have today. So I don't have time to go into any of the other policies that the federal, state, and local governments followed. There were many, many of them. Perhaps we'll have time to discuss some of them in the question period. But the bottom line is that every one of us, as citizens of this constitutional democracy, has an obligation not only to improve conditions in disadvantaged neighborhoods, but to undo the segregated patterns that cause so many of the problems, social problems that we have in this country. It's not just housing segregation. It's the violence we see when we concentrate African Americans with little hope in single neighborhoods like in Ferguson or many other places in this country. It's the achievement gap in schools that I began being so worried about, that is a product primarily of residential segregation. It's the lack of mobility of African Americans. We know that African Americans who grow up poor African Americans who grow up in low-income neighborhoods have less chance of having middle-class incomes as adults than similarly poor African Americans who grow up in less segregated neighborhoods. So the social problems that we've accumulated and built upon as a result of this segregated structure that we've created are enormous. We have an obligation to undo them, and I hope that we will figure out together how to do so. So thank you very much. Any questions now? Questions now? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we're going to take a few questions now.
Sure.
I know there are no shy people in this room, so if I can ask you to project. We are working on getting some handheld mics, but I don't want to hold that up any further because I know there are questions that you would like to explore. Is that one?
Yeah.
Oh, look what we found. So I think there's a question to start back here, and we'll work on getting another one.
I enjoyed your presentation, and of course, Detroit is exactly the same as you described. But it's still the same, and I wondered if you commented in your book, or could do so now, about the specific structures that are used to reinforce segregation in a gentrifying society that not just Detroit, but major cities are going through, that include tax foreclosure, water issues, a land bank that insists on prioritizing selling to big developers rather than people who have actually been living in the homes for years.
Well, let me make a couple of points. I obviously can't go into all of the things you just mentioned, but it's always easier in any situation to focus on the things that are changing rather than the underlying base that remains the same. We all know that. And while there are many, many issues that arise out of gentrification, the important thing to remember is that the vast majority of whites continue to live in predominantly white suburban areas, not in gentrifying communities, and the vast majority of African Americans continue to live in low-income segregated neighborhoods. Gentrification is changing this a bit on the margins, but we should not lose track of the underlying reality, which is 90% of the problem, not the 10% that attracts our attention because it's changing. So far as gentrification itself goes, I'm all in favor of gentrification if it could be stabilized. Every community should be gentrified. Every community should have a mix of affluent, moderate, market rate, low-income housing. That's what we want. The problem with the way in which most of us tend to view gentrification is reformers tend to want to figure out how to preserve a share of housing in gentrifying communities for previous residents. And there are lots of techniques from inclusionary zoning to property tax rate freezes and so forth that can be done to do that. But again, that's only a small part of the problem, because even if we were able to create stable integration in a gentrifying community by preserving a share of housing in that community for a diverse population, it would still be the case that most people would be displaced. And where are they being displaced to? They're being displaced to new segregated areas, just simply shifting the disadvantaged population around, because most of the suburbs that we've created on a racially exclusive basis remain closed to them. So we need policies that address gentrification in two ways. One is to preserve a share of housing in those neighborhoods for previous residents, but the other is to ensure that people who are displaced get to move to high opportunity communities, and that is not happening. The two major programs that we have for low-income housing families today, as you all know, are the Section 8 program and the low-income housing tax credit. I don't know if you're involved in that program, but both of them reinforce segregation today, because the low-income housing tax credits are predominantly used, not exclusively, but predominantly used to finance developments in already low-income segregated neighborhoods. Developers would much prefer to. Oh, did I do something? The microphone went off, though. Yeah. Hello? Hello? Well, I'll try to shout. Yeah. Hello? No. Do you ever hear the word "let well enough alone"? Testing. Okay. Yeah. Well, all right. That's yeah. Okay. In any event, developers would much rather build a low-income housing tax credit development in an already low-income segregated neighborhood. You know, frequently the land is cheaper there, not always, but certainly you don't have to have 100 meetings to explain to community residents why you're putting poor people and particularly black people into their community. So it reinforces segregation. Same thing is true of the Section 8 program, the Housing Choice Voucher program. A low-income family with a Section 8 voucher is much more likely to live in a segregated neighborhood than an equally low-income family who doesn't have a voucher, because of the way in which the voucher program is structured. And I don't have time to go into that now, but I talk about it a little bit in the book. So those are two easy things we could reform if we wanted to promote integration, is those two programs. And then, of course, the biggest housing, I'll just wrap up real quickly, the biggest housing program of all the federal government runs is a subsidy to the segregated white middle-class communities all over the country in the form of the low-income housing tax credit. I'm sorry, in the form of a mortgage interest deduction, which is the biggest federal housing program, far more than the tax credit or the Housing Choice Voucher program. And we could use that as a tool of integration if we were really motivated to desegregate the society. One of the things I suggest in the book is that communities that refuse to desegregate, for example, by maintaining exclusionary zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of townhouses or even low-rise apartments or single-family homes on small lot sizes. Communities that refuse to repeal those kinds of ordinances, homeowners in those communities could have their mortgage interest deductions put into escrow until they did take steps to desegregate. So that if we had the will, there are many things we could do to address this. We don't have the will at this point. Yeah.
Excuse.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Questions around the room.
Okay, you call on people. I won't.
Okay,
Yeah.
so she has the microphone.
I've been asked to keep this quick, but I want to say a quick thank you. I have two quick questions. I liked where you were going towards the end with the solutions, and I wanted to ask you other steps that we could take to undo segregated patterns. And, you know, if you would talk about things, ambitious things like reparations and that sort of thing. But I also wanted to see if you had a comment on gerrymandering, because we're seeing, and there was a report on NPR today, that gerrymandering has impact, for example, on insurance prices, because politically uncompetitive districts are showing these kinds of economic impacts as well. So I wanted to know if you had a comment on that.
Well, I won't waste time pretending to know something I don't know anything about, so I'm going to pass on that question. I don't.
Question then?
Oh, sure, about remedies. Well, there are many remedies, both radical and modest. The low-income housing tax credit reform and the Section 8 reform, I talked about very modest ones. At the other extreme, what if, and this is not politically realistic at all at this point. We first need to develop a national understanding and commitment and some new civil rights movement around these problems and an understanding of the de jure nature that we're obligated to remedy. But if we did, and this is just fanciful, I'm not suggesting it's politically realistic, the federal government should, well, let's take Levittown, for example. Levittown today, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited future discrimination, now has about 2% African-American population in a broader area that is 15, 20% African-American. Well, the federal government should buy up the next homes that come up for sale in Levittown for whatever the price is, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and resell them to qualified African-Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. And if we had a national understanding of the history I described, the courts would have to uphold it because it's so narrowly targeted. So that would be at the extreme, at the other extreme.
Your discussion was worth the price of admission.
What was the price of admission?
Nothing. But I'm glad that I'm here. My question is, I grew up in the 50s when Eisenhower started the freeway system. You mentioned that the system enabled some of the suburbs to be created. in this city, the system also wiped out some very prominent communities throughout, and it lasted. I used to play in the freeway when they were building I-74 when I was about 8. When I was a teenager, they also built the Jeffries Freeway, and they built I-75 through the most prominent black community. To what extent is that de facto or is that de jure?
There's abundant evidence, and I describe some of it in the book, that the routing of freeways was frequently, not always, but frequently racially motivated, designed to wipe out African American communities that were, and the highway planners were explicit about this. It was not, you don't have to infer this as the benign effect. This was something that they admitted, that was their desire. Certainly it was true in Hamtramck here. Hamtramck had a significant African American neighborhood before the Chrysler Expressway was built, and that was wiped out deliberately when the routing was done. In Chicago, certainly you're all familiar with the Dan Ryan Expressway, which was built not the expressway wasn't built for this purpose, but the routing was done for this purpose. The Dan Ryan Expressway separates white from black working class neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. That's why it was routed that way. In Miami, the expressways were designed to demolish a black neighborhood called Overton, which was too close to downtown for people's tastes at that point. And Miami had a city plan which designated where African Americans should live, and the expressway was routed for the purpose of moving them to that area. So there's lots of evidence that this was racially explicit. Not always, but in many cases it was. Let me just say, I'm going to say one other thing. You know, I do a lot of these talks, and I have to tell you that every city I go to, people try to convince me that their city is much worse in this respect than any other. So don't let it go to your head.
So we're going to take one more question and then one there, and then that's it. So I know we could keep this going for hours.
You know, in our modern society, we don't talk about race when we have government policy right now. We use things as a proxy for race. So in education, test scores are a proxy for race, or credit scores are a proxy, and you can find some correlations between those things in race and poverty. And our government policy definitely punishes people who are at one end of the economic spectrum, whether it is through tax foreclosures. And you know, so I look at disparate impact as something that we can definitely see there's a disparate impact in tax foreclosures in Detroit and race, but nobody will say we're taking homes from black people. I don't even know if that's the intended policy. But when you look at all of the things that came before that created this financial insecurity inside of communities, and now you have punishment for that, or that created these lower test scores, and now you have punitive policy for that, how do we begin to look at de jure racism through a colorblind lens that kind of exists right now?
Well, I think it exists less and less. We do have the beginnings of a new civil rights movement in this country, very beginnings. We're certainly having a more honest and passionate conversation about race in this country than we've had ever before in history. It was begun, I guess, by the Black Lives Matter movement after Ferguson. But we've had, if you don't read my book, you know, there's one thing that you should read that's much shorter, and that is the speech that Mayor Mitch Landrieu gave when he removed the statue of Robert E. Lee in New Orleans. 5 years ago, it was inconceivable that a white elected Southern politician could give a speech that was as passionate and as empathetic and as accurate about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow and their effects today as that speech. So I think there's and when I wrote this book, you know, I expected, you know, I've written other books before, and you know, a month after I publish a book, I move on to something else. I'm stunned by the reception that this book has had, because there's an interest in talking about race. You know, in the late 1990s, President Clinton, you may recall, began a national conversation about race. Remember that? And he spoke to himself for about a week, and that was the end of it. Well, we're now having that national conversation. It's not nearly deep enough, but we're not in a colorblind conversation any longer. I think that We certainly have opposing tendencies in this society that are much more explicit. But we do have a growing awareness of this problem, and it needs to grow much more before we can do anything about it, but that's our challenge.
I don't know if you had a chance to read the Raj Chetty and colleagues paper that was recently published that isolated race as the determinant for long-term social immobility and inequality amongst African Americans. But what haunted me about that study particularly was the fact that 5% of African Americans who do manage to move into high-income neighborhoods that are less segregated, who have better outcomes than the rest, nevertheless have poorer outcomes compared to their white counterparts. And so the notion that somehow we can move people, or not move, I scratch that, but that moving into a higher income neighborhood, a less desegregated income neighborhood might result in better outcomes is challenged by that piece of evidence a little bit.
Well, not really. It doesn't challenge that they have better outcomes. It challenges that all problems are solved by that, but they certainly do have better outcomes as a result. In your description of the paper, you said that they were better, but just not as good as white outcomes. I'd be quite happy if we could get to the point where everybody made as much progress as the people you're talking about, even if it's not perfect progress yet. But that would be a good first step.
Please join me again in thanking.